So I'm John Kutsch, and as he said, I'm the conceptual designer of that system there. And that's a lot of CAD pushing. So my background, I'll give you a tiny little background about myself. I started an engineering consultancy, and so the short story of how I got to be standing in front of you is we had a client, and the client had an extraordinarily expensive and very hard to get substance that they used in their electronic system, and the guy didn't know anything. You know, he was just sort of like a marketing guy, and he's like, "We need to replace this," and he must have had a periodic table sitting in front of him, because he would call us up and say, "Will lead work?" And we'd say, "No." Tin, and I could tell he was just like going row by row through the, and eventually, we would give him these little reports, and some stuff actually might have kind of worked, but he eventually gets, all the way through the whole thing to thorium. He's like, "What about thorium?" I'm like, "I don't know nothing about thorium. What the hell are you talking about?" I said, "Look, my partner's a chemical engineer. We'll look into it as usual and give you a little report." And so we looked into it, and it turns out thorium is the third nuclear fuel. It's thorium, uranium, plutonium, right? So those are the three things you can use as a nuclear fuel. And that's from the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. But the trouble is, and we can go into excruciating detail about this later, or you can take me out for a beer at the Trident Club and I'll bore you to tears. But essentially, thorium got left behind because other tracks had started to be pursued. So light water reactors on submarines, civilian version of those had come on shore and started to become power plants. And so the supply chain just started going towards that light water route. And now thorium can be used in a light water reactor, but back in the 60s, what they really wanted to do was use it in a type of reactor called a molten salt reactor. Oddly enough, the light water reactor and the molten salt reactor were invented or patented by the same guy. So we'll get into a little bit more of that history. But what happened was I was so intrigued that we had this missed opportunity, that we had built these reactors in the 60s, ran them for 23,000 consecutive hours. These were not paper reactors. This wasn't some little sketch in Popular Science. This was a real deal and a huge opportunity that had been missed. And so when I reported back to my client, he said, "So what about thorium?" I said, "It's garbage." And it really is. It's basically mining waste these days. And he's like, "Garbage." And I said, "But it could save the world." And he's like, "Wait, how could garbage save the world?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you." So that's sort of what I'm here partly to talk about today, and then also mostly to talk about what the geopolitical implications of that might be. So let's see here. Is that forward? Okay. So eventually I started an organization called Thorium Energy Alliance to promote the use of thorium in molten salt reactors and also rare earths, because, and this, I'm going to try and keep it top level for you, but where do you get thorium? Unlike uranium, you get thorium in rare earth mineralizations like monazite, bastnäsite, xenotime. And where you get rare earth mineralizations? Well, it's a byproduct of mining things like iron ore, titanium ore, phosphate. So there's one single phosphate mine in Florida that could supply the entire needs of the United States with rare earths. And once you process the rare earths, which are used in all sorts of electronic applications and magnets and things like that, well, you're left with a lot of thorium too. And so I think a pretty good thing to do would be to start producing rare earths in this country again and take that thorium and use it for vast amounts of carbon-free domestic power. And that thought occurred to some other people who started with me a company called Terrestrial Energy. And Terrestrial Energy is the craziest thing you're ever going to hear of, because not only is it a startup, but it's nuclear. And when you put nuclear and startup together, they want to commit you to the loony bin. I mean, I always joke that if we had started up Angry Birds, we'd be billionaires by now. So every million we raise for Terrestrial Energy is like raising $1 billion for anybody else, because it's tough. It's tough to explain to people, hey, I want to start a very long lead time, highly regulated energy business. What do you think about that? And they're like, oh, wow, that is the worst thing you could ever say. You know, but the way we do get it is the story is extraordinarily compelling. You know, I'm not going to do the worst thing in the world and just read my own thing right back to you. You guys can read this. But those are some pretty compelling bullet points, right? If you have a reactor system that can basically fit in this room, make 400 megawatts of carbon-free power, run on what essentially is either our existing uranium, our thorium. We could use spent nuclear fuel, SNF. We have enough spent nuclear fuel sitting in the parking lots of United States reactors that when you burn nuclear fuel in a light water reactor, you're only getting about 1 to 5% of the energy that's in there. 95% is left over. And so we got enough power sitting in the parking lots of the United States nuclear infrastructure to power the United States for 500 years if we had if we built about 1,000 molten salt reactors. And that's not electric power, that's all power. That's liquid fuels, that's industrial process heat, that's electricity. So we have a vast storehouse of energy. America is already energy independent nuclear-wise if we just use the spent nuclear fuel sitting in our. So, you know, a lot of people say, what do you want to do with nuclear waste? I want to burn it, and I want to make power out of it, and I want to reduce it by 1,000 times and get some use out of it. So it's not the most exciting illustration, but we have the main takeaway is that we sort of have a little bit of a razor blade and batteries aspect to our design, in that we have a replaceable core, and in this core, I'll show you later, there's the graphite core, primary heat exchangers, possibly pumps, but we might have natural circulation. Everything that is the reactor is in this, essentially what amounts to a big battery. And we get about 7 years out of the graphite core before it starts to get a little funky. And at 7 years, maybe 10 years if we do a little bit lower power density, a little shorter if we do higher power density, but around 7 years, we replace the core, sort of like a giant battery. And that way, what that gives us the advantage of is that we always have a brand new core. We're always using the latest technology. That gives us a chance to upgrade the facility every 7 years. And it keeps a supply chain running. So here's the most basic, you know, sort of like diagram that you're going to see of what we're talking about here. So what's interesting about these molten salt reactors is that we're not using water for coolant. So you can put these things in the desert, right? We don't need a giant lake. We don't need a river. These things can be air cooled. And the fuel is not solid. For those of you who know, like light water reactors or even a pebble bed reactor or something like that, the fuel is solid. It's either in a rod or a ball or something. In a molten salt reactor, we take salt. It's not unlike the salt on your kitchen table, but ours is a fluoride salt instead of a sodium salt, and or a chloride salt. And we take that salt and we melt it at about 450, 500 degrees Celsius. And when we do that, we have uranium tetrafluoride in there. And so the fuel and the coolant are the same thing. So we never are going to have some sort of like loss of coolant accident, right? Because if we lose the coolant, that means we lost the fuel also. So the fuel is in the salt, and the salt is melted at a high temperature. And once it melts at 500 degrees, we send it through the graphite moderator. And the only place that the salt becomes hot is in the moderated region, right? So it's getting hot, 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 hot. Once it leaves, you got a couple delayed neutrons, a little bit of things like that. But essentially, this is where it gets hot. Outside here, it circulates up, goes into the primary heat exchangers, back down to the downcomer, back around the merry-go-round. That's it. That's your whole reactor. So you can imagine that you don't really need these motors. You could actually depend on natural circulation pretty easily. This is basically a big lava lamp, right? And the only place you're making heat is in the moderated graphite region. And so what that allows you to say is once the fuel leaves the moderated core, you know, you're out of danger. You're not making more energy. You're not making more heat. And in case of an emergency or for maintenance or something, you can push all this salt back out of the system, The salt cools on its own. If you spring a leak, meteorite hits, or alien zombies come and gnaw their way through to eat your fuel salt, it comes spilling out of here. Once it leaves the core, it's on the ground and it's cooling. And cooling in the world of salt means that once it gets below 450 degrees, it has recrystallized. It's an ionic molecule, so it captures all the fuel and all the byproducts in the matrix of the salt itself. The salt is easily handled. The fuel itself is easily handled. The waste profile of the salt is relatively small. You can refine the salt after you're finished using it. You could do vacuum distillation to it. You can refine it, or you could just store it and wait for a future and smarter generation to think of something to do with it. So it's got a lot of good qualities, and one of the best qualities, one of the most far-reaching qualities, is that you heat it up to about 500 degrees to get the process going, but once the process gets going, it's about 650 degrees here, enters here, and exits at about 850 degrees Celsius. It's pretty toasty. Our heat exchangers take a big bite of that heat, send it off to do work, and then we have a secondary heat exchanger and then a tertiary heat exchanger. So no nuclear fuel leaves this reactor. This reactor is considered a pool type reactor in that there's no penetrations from the bottom or sides. All penetrations happen from the top. So any of you fellows that are familiar with ASME, that makes for an extraordinarily strong and safe vessel. Also makes for a pretty cheap vessel. This is not under pressure, right? So this is running at atmosphere, maybe up to 1 bar, but not 3,000 PSI like a light water reactor. So that allows us to use a 2-inch thick vessel wall instead of a 24-inch thick vessel wall. So what we like to say is that the inherent safety lowers the cost. Why do we think these things are so spectacular? Is because you're probably talking about at least a 4 to 10 times reduction in cost. And since none of the nuclear fuel leaves the reactor, we take a secondary salt, bring it over here, take that salt and heat a nitrate salt up to 600 degrees, and we can send it to whatever process we want. Do we want to make electricity? Well, maybe in the middle of the day you want to make electricity when you get the highest price possible. What you probably really want to do is go into a salt battery, and we're developing some excellent salt battery technology too. Some of you may have heard about salt batteries. They come from the solar concentrator business. So this is a nitrate salt battery where we can store vast amounts of thermal energy, much more than, like if you follow Tesla and he just delivered, a big battery to Australia, and we're like, you're going to spend millions and millions of dollars on this ridiculously tiny battery that only lasts, 15 minutes to an hour. I'll give you a battery. I'll give you a battery that can, run an entire industrial complex for a couple days, if you had to. The other thing that's nice about this is that we can let intermittent, unreliable, spiky, peaky, grid-destroying renewables and feed into the battery. Did I give away some skeptical? I don't know if I was thinking that or said that, but anyways, we can feed this. We can take the electricity and this heat, and we can do process uses. At 3 in the morning, you don't get hardly any money for electricity. So, why does nuclear have to carry the baseload energy needs of society? Nuclear would be so much better off if it had something else valuable it could do. Desalinate water, crack water into hydrogen and oxygen. Take this process heat and make cement. All the other. When you make 600 degrees Celsius heat, making electricity is pretty far down on the list of things you want to do with it. So again, this really existed. So that's the core of the molten salt reactor experiment that ran at Oak Ridge National Lab from 1965 until 1970. And then they did a few other experiments from 70 to 80 when it was finally killed off for good. You can see there's they're celebrating the successful startup of the reactor. I don't know if you can read that, but it says 6,000 full power hours. It was a miracle of engineering. It was made for $9,999,000, and they made it for that because if they went $1 over, they would have had to report back to the Pentagon the next level of spending up, you know, because back then this was a Air Force program, Air Force sponsored program, I believe. You know, it was 30 guys. 30 guys designed and built that reactor in 4 years and ran it for 5 and experimented with it for another 10. Can you imagine how fast it is? You know, just as a little aside, to talk about what a fabulous engineering country we used to be, Idaho National Labs has this presentation you can find online, but they built 70 experimental reactors from 1948 to 1978, and then they didn't build a single one after that. It's like, man, they were building 2 reactors, sometimes more than 2 reactors a year, and then nothing.
So, John, what would the opponents of this say for disadvantages? What would they add to this if they had to? That has some credibility, if any. Because so far it's a plus.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that, you know, I'm sorry?
They'd say it gives off radiation. So,
yeah, I mean, that's what they would say. It's you know, I've had some people say, well, that's man-made radiation, not natural radiation. I'm like, oh, you are smart. But you know what? I honestly, I have, you know, I get that question all the time, and you know, not to be coy, but really, you know, what are the disadvantages? There aren't. I mean, the waste profile. A lot of people don't realize that, like coal, for instance. I mean, that's sort of a boogeyman to pick on. But you know, you could mine coal and extract the rare earths and the uranium out of coal and get more energy from the uranium in coal than in the coal itself. You know, so people are like, well, it's going to create waste. It's like, what doesn't create waste? You know, we've just transferred the enormous waste profile of so-called renewables onto the backs. It's renewables, if nothing else, is racist energy, because we've said, hey, yellow Chinaman, you take your tellurium and your heavy metal poisoning from the production of solar cells, you take the tremendous environmental damage from your filthy 100-year-old way to process rare earths, and you build our magnets and our windmill cores and our solar cells and our inverters and send them back to Monterey, where we can live in a glorious paradise of palm trees and green and blue skies. And it's like, you live in filth, you get tellurium poisoning. You know, they have solar riots, they call them, in China, because so many manufacturers have switched to, like, washing machine manufacturers have gotten into like the solar cell business. And so it's like, anybody who says, well, these make waste, it's like, I hate to tell you, but all energy kills, all right? You want energy, you want to live this high up on the pyramid, you are going to be killing something, and you are going to be wasting something, and you're going to be creating a waste pile somehow. So if you're going to do that, no matter what, why don't you choose the safest, cheapest, best, lowest profile waste creator of them all? And that's the integral molten salt reactor. You know, if we insist on living this high up on the pyramid, we should do it in the lightest possible manner, and that's it. That really is it. I hope I answered your question.
Say what you mean, right?
Yes, sir.
So a lot of, you know, you said that we have to use a liquid salt, and there's a lot of concerns over years about different corrosions, and I'm curious how much we know about the corrosions that happen in this kind of environment, because this is not an environment. We have the one Oak Ridge National Lab operation, and I don't know if it uses the same salt you're proposing.
Pretty much, close. So that's an excellent question, and the MSRE, so where the corrosion would come from salt is impurities that get in the salt if we let oxygen get in there, if we let moisture get in there. The MSRE itself, when they ended the experiment, they cut chunks out of it to examine it. You know, they didn't have any corrosion from a brand new alloy they had back then called Hastelloy N. The graphite did not have any wetting, which means, you know, it didn't absorb any of the salt. It didn't have porosity issues. You know, so I'm not saying that there aren't some, you know, the graphite core in particular is still an engineering challenge. It's not like, gee, you know, miracle needs to occur here, but it's definitely a challenge, because what happens is graphite shrinks under neutron damage for about, in our case, it shrinks for like 3.5 years. And then after 3.5 years, it grows. And because we have different regions, the center sort of shrinks faster than the outside, and then it grows faster than the outside. So that's, when you're trying to hold a big bundle of, pencil leads together, essentially, that makes for some weirdness to go on in there. And it's an engineering challenge. How are we gonna keep all those fuel channels together? Some people have chosen not to use a moderated core. Some people, like TerraPower, which was owned by Bill Gates. TerraPower is using a non-moderated sodium, a chloride reactor. Now the trouble with that is your startup fuel load is pretty big and pretty highly enriched. And chloride really does have some funky corrosion things going on. So they need to use the kinds of materials that are called refractory metals, things like tungsten, even more exotic than our stuff. Our stuff is using kind of high nickel metal alloys. So we're going to see, does TerraPower win out with their chloride reactor, or does Terrestrial Energy? I wish we'd picked slightly different names. We should have had it. We should have had like it should have been like, somebody's got to have like Bounty Power, and the other, because it's like TerraPower, Terrestrial Power, Transit Time. I'm like, what's with all the T's? I even mix it up sometimes. I'm like, yeah, terrestrial. But this does show the pedigree. This is the smarter, and it goes even further to the passive cooling nature. This, what you're not seeing in there, this is a primary heat exchanger, and this is a DRAX. And the DRAX basically is just a heat exchanger that's a constant drag. So imagine, you guys are sailors, or nominally sailors, I would imagine, and those sock anchors you throw behind your boat, and it basically keeps you from moving in a current. It's not a real anchor that you throw into the dirt. Well, so that's what this is. It's sort of like a parasitic load that if you ever, the zombie apocalypse comes and you're like, I'm out of here, and you run out and you forget to hit the stop button, the reactor will start to run down all by itself, right? And because we put a parasitic load on it, it actually runs down very, very quickly. Within a couple days, it would solidify. I should have mentioned that passive safety nature. A light water reactor, you are constantly trying to keep it from running out of control, right? So as you're putting rods in and you're pulling them out and you're trying to dampen and then follow a load, and you're running pumps and pumps and pumps and backup pumps to those to keep the water flowing, and you're doing everything possible to keep your core from melting. Whereas these reactors, it's just the opposite. It's like a built-in dead man switch. Every day you're having to add a little bit more fuel. Every day you're having to moderate the fuel salt. And the minute you stop doing that, the reactor's like, well, I'm getting sleepy, I'm going down, I'm going to turn into a little rock now, And so these things are that's what makes these things inherently walk-away safe. They literally, the second you let go of the switch, like a dead man switch on a train, the second you let go of the switch, it goes back to a neutral position and coasts. Literally, that's how we describe it. It coasts down. And so that's the pedigree, the molten salt reactor experiment, the DMSR, which is our fuel use profile. So we use new fuel, and we're not recycling fuel at this point. We're not even using thorium exactly. Maybe we'll use thorium as sort of a moderating element. But for right now, we're going to be fairly traditional and use uranium-235. So this new work from Oak Ridge and this older work from Oak Ridge comes together, and this is where the integral molten salt reactor is. So again, a little cross section of it, a little less cartoony cross section, not entirely less, but we're very much a belts and suspenders company with this reactor design. The fuel comes up, goes around, but we also put an outer secondary jacket in case this one springs a leak. Then we got another liner, and then we got a concrete barrier. So, we're trying to do a lot of belts and suspenders and clips and rope and everything to keep the public and the regulators and everybody happy that we've, the trouble with doing that much safety, is that people are like, whoa, what do you have to be so safe for? We even had the Canadian regulator was like, what do you need all that for? Take all that out of there. We're like, you know, we'll keep it. But it does. You know, this is where we are. We can't debate about this stuff logically anymore. You know, people have emotional reactions to this. And if you put too little, people freak out. If you put too much, people freak out. They're like, hey, what are you not telling us there? But again, you see, this is what attracted me to it 10 years ago, was this is elegant and simple and efficient, and everything an engineer really reacts to as an excellent design. So it's an A-B type system. So the way we run it is we put reactor A goes in there, starts up. About 6 years into it, we bring another reactor in here, put it together, test it, bring it in here, and put it in silo B. That one gets started up. This one gets shut down. We allow it to cool and get its act together. These things are still putting out radiation after all. You know, we give it about 6 years. At about the 6-year mark, we pick it out, put it in one of these storage silos, which is just a lined concrete, you know, hole in the ground. We put the new one there, turn that one off, let it sit for 6 years, go. So it's A, B, A, B. So you're not seeing two operating reactors. You're seeing just one reactor nuclear island, and only one of these runs at a time. And then we store fuel salt and coolant salt and spent salt in a vault. And then we have this sort of, this is that system I was talking about, that coolant system. You see these pipes here, you know, take heat up and out, and these bring it back. And it's a closed system, so it goes around, and it's basically our parasitic drag. We're always taking about 2 or 3 megawatts of heat and voluntarily throwing it away so that we are assured of a quick coast down. So this is where it starts. Now that you get an idea about how the technology goes, this is what really matters to you guys in your career, and maybe hopefully you guys are into policy making, or at least you keep your tabs on it. This is what you want to do with this, right? You don't want to make electricity. I mean, you make it when it makes a lot of sense and a lot of money. But, you know, your nuclear island and your balance of plant and your little switch yard, you know, you can feed that electricity direct to the city, but you can also redirect that electricity over here, and you can redirect the salt to a big thermal salt battery, store tens, if not hundreds of megawatts of thermal energy. And with that, you know, and then of course you can, you know, it's hard to see windmills from above, but you know, your windmills and your solar, can contribute to your salt battery here when they're getting all bouncy and weird. And then what do you do with that hot salt? Well, you can do high temperature steam electrolysis. So if you can do steam electrolysis at around 600 degrees Celsius, throw a little electricity added on top of there, you can very, very efficiently rip water apart. You know, ripping water apart is pretty energy intensive, but if you got vast amounts of energy, that's a pretty good thing to do, because now you got oxygen and you got hydrogen, two of the most primary industrial gases you could hope to have. And then so what do you could feed that feedstock and that salt energy to petroleum distillation, or you could do like South Africa does and the Germans did in World War II. You can take coal and the Fischer-Tropsch process and turn coal into the best sulfur-free jet fuel there is, JP6, JP8. You know, the one reason the Luftwaffe almost kicked our asses in World War II is that they used man-made fuel, and their man-made fuel had about 10% more power density to it than our fuel refined from the ground. So that's when we came up with ethyl fuel. Just a little historical note there. So we could make sulfur free. We could turn coal from the filthiest of fuels to maybe not a clean fuel, but much, much less dirty fuel, because that way we'd be taking coal, getting vast amounts of liquid fuel from it, but we'd also be getting, when you don't burn coal and you capture all this stuff and not send it up the flue, you're getting uranium, you're getting mercury, you're getting sulfur, you're getting a lot of ash that cement companies would kill for. I mean, there's a lot of good things you get from, so you could turn coal from $50 a ton junk into $1,800 a ton jet fuel, plus whatever you get for all the other byproducts. That's not bad. That's a pretty good value add to coal. And then you can like do some water desalination. One of the greatest things we could do with our process heat is here in California. Aside from the fact that you got a little bit of drizzle the other night, you're never getting enough water. You got 40 million plus people and growing. It's an endless drought from here on out. It'd be nice if you had some nice water to drink. And so you can see the knock-on effects. I mean, this stuff is nice, some electricity generation, but this is really nice. And I'll tell you that, when you're able to do that, and here's where your policy starts to come in, you're disrupting a $72 trillion supply chain market. And if you can deeply decarbonize your economy, you can do some pretty interesting things to what's happening geopolitically, right? You get countries that are 95% dependent on liquid fuels for their income and for their domestic energy, and some strange things are going to happen to those societies when they're not needed anymore, right? And they see it. They see it coming. There's the KCARE, the Kingdom Arabia Renewable Energy City. They're building 9 nuclear reactors there. We were speaking earlier, Iran really does need nuclear power. They can't continue to burn the furniture. There's so many more better things we could do with petroleum. We could make plastics, we could make medicines, we can make fertilizers. The idea, 1,000 years from now, our great-great-grandchildren are going to be like the insanity of burning natural gas that we could have turned into ethylene. The insanity of burning fuels for fuel and not to make stuff out of and recycle endlessly. They're gonna think we were the most insane, irrational morons that ever walked. We're gonna look bad. So I'll just stick to that. But we can start to look great. Yes, sir.
So it sounds like with these thorium reactors that the non-electricity products produced are of much higher value than the electricity you're generating.
Yep.
Which would, it seems in that case, then the primary customers for these sort of things would be industrial corporations instead of public utilities.
Could be, because they're smaller too. You're talking about their economic. Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're a military base, we could talk all about that. We could, if you're a forward operating base, our friend Colonel Rogie gives a beautiful talk, a very moving talk. He said, 3,500 people died in Afghanistan. 2,500 of those people died delivering jerry cans of fuel and water to the forward operating base. He said no soldier should die delivering water and fuel. If they're going to die in combat, that's one thing. You don't want that either. But no one should die in a convoy for such a stupid thing, for such an insane supply chain problem. If you had a small 10 megawatt version of one of these, they're not economic by a normal sense, but they're economic in the fact that it could save thousands of lives. And on site, you could have a miniature version of all of this. You could make all the fuel that your tanks and your Cobras and everything need. You could make all the water your soldiers need. And you could make anything else you need right on site, including the electricity, because, the soldier is electrified these days, right? How many batteries does your average soldier have to cart around with them for night vision and everything else, telecommunications? But even in a civilian mode, even for, a big plant like this, you could have an economic reactor down to, 80 megawatts. We have an 80 megawatt design that's excellent. 200 megawatts thermal, And because these are so high temperature, for those of you who passed your thermo classes, the higher the temperature differential, we get, 50 plus percent efficiency. So, unlike a light water reactor, which makes about a third of its power into electricity, if we have a 400 megawatt thermal reactor, the integral molten salt reactor, primary design is 400 megawatts thermal, we're making 193 megawatts at least of electricity if that's all we make with it. And that's with off-the-shelf Siemens SST 5000 genset. That's not even using anything odd and exotic like CO2 and supercritical and Brayton and all that stuff. You don't even need that. You get up to 53% and load following and all that with an off-the-shelf catalog item like an SST 5000. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. seems like there's a lot more, beyond the private industry things for these, but if you were to sell these at a private industry level, are there particular regulatory issues that would come, with selling nuclear reactors into Bob's private manufacturing?
Oh yeah, there's endless regulatory thing. In the United States, the nuclear reactor is done when the paperwork and the reactor weigh the same. It's like so this leads us to another unfortunate policy. What is our policy now? The NRC and the DOE have set about. I'm on working up regulations for small modular molten salt reactors. I'm on a ANS, American Nuclear Society committee called ANS 20.2, also trying to figure out what the base regulatory definition, like what is a molten salt reactor? I mean, it seems like that shouldn't be that hard, but it's been years of, crazy bureaucratic work, but we're getting there, and that's us. That's the Western world. We believe in, law and order and stuff like that. But I tell you who's not waiting. China isn't waiting. They're spending billions on this. They have thousands of people working on this exact scenario. We'll talk about that later. But even Canada. I mean, the company I do work for and that I helped found, Terrestrial Energy, is a Canadian company. Now, I'm the vice president of Terrestrial Energy USA. So, I mean, I try and explain to people that it's like General Motors owns Chevy and Opel, but you don't see Opels in the United States very much. And you don't see Chevys in Germany all that often. They are their own markets, their own versions of the integral molten salt reactor will be made for each market. But I'm telling you right now, most of the work and most of the regulatory work that we've gotten through, because it's a little bit friendlier to a nuclear startup, is, Canada, because you can take it in small bites, whereas the NRC, you need to do one big submission all at once. And there's a company called NuScale which just did a submission for a small modular reactor last year, and that was 20 years and $600 million, So we don't have that time, In 18 months, we managed to get to VDR 1 up in Canada, which was the vendor design review 1. It's pretty good. So here's some supporting information for you. This was developed by Idaho National Lab, so this isn't just us saying this. Using all the thermal work and extraordinarily conservative take on how the integral molten salt reactor would work. And you might wonder, this is a graph. This is a graph of costs, but because we make it constantly, it's a pretty boring graph. We're the same, we're the same. This is natural gas. This is hydrogen from natural gas versus hydrogen from high steam electrolysis. We are already the cheapest way to make hydrogen. If we could magically make one of these IMSRs appear today. So people are always like, how are you going to compete with $2 a million BTU natural gas? How do you compete with that? Well, for one, natural gas isn't going to stay $2 and $3 a million BTU. But, the only thing you can safely say about the price of natural gas is that it's erratic and it's going to change. Anyone who says they can predict what it is high. So you can see there that, already if we could have this technology today, we don't even have to worry about whether natural gas is $2 or even down to $1.50, $1.40. Gulf Coast, you want to make natural gas in the Gulf Coast, Houston to Louisiana, we still beat you. We'd still beat you. And you know who else knows this? Our competitors, in other countries understand that too. So, total cost of systems, comparing it to other advanced solar PV, solar thermal, other nuclear Gen 3 like Westinghouse AP1000. This is the most conservative number because we're making many of these and because we're building them in a factory and because when you build things in a factory and you build them in the same environment, we aren't building these things out in the rain. We're not building one and then one and then one. We're mass producing these things. If we don't, then we're not in business, it's quits. We're mass producing these things, and with that you get a learning scale and a learning curve and an economy of scale. And that number there that's That's unit number one, worst case scenario. It's going to be a lot lower than that. Yes, sir.
Is that total system cost, the capital cost to build the reactor, or is that total system cost to build it
And run it.
operating through its lifetime?
That's total system cost to turn one on. Right. And so you can see these also are some of the total inputs for that total system cost, right there on that side. Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, sir, the language you said we're building, so as an active present, how many do you have built right now? Or are you saying
No, we don't.
the projected model is to build this at that?
Yeah, we have some excellent potential clients. We in Canada, it's not giving away any state secrets to say that the government supports us a lot, so that Canada wants to remain a nuclear nation, and if they want to remain a nuclear nation, they know the days of their can-do are limited. They have got a unique system up there, heavy water reactors called can-do reactors, but they're refurbishing them right now, but it's the last time they're going to do it, and it's probably the last gasp of the can-do, a beautiful reactor system, but it's got about 20 more years, maybe 30 on the books, and then they're going to have to switch to something new, and IMSR is probably about it. So there's obviously likely candidates then. Do you repower closed coal plants? Which we can, because now you got the security. If you don't have coal sitting around, you got security setbacks. These are relatively tiny systems. They take up a fairly small footprint. So that's an excellent idea. They're brownfield sites that already have the electric, connection to the grid. Tear down the coal plant, clean up the coal, and put a small, tiny little nuclear facility where the coal plant used to be. And so you could also imagine existing nuke plants, Bruce Power, Point Lepreau, Pickering, places like that offer more opportunities for places where you could put molten salt reactor system. Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, some Western, Canada's very, very enthusiastic about getting into this because, they want to sell, they already make a tremendous amount of money selling electricity to New England. And we keep doing things like shutting down Vermont and Yankee completely unnecessarily and shutting down Indian Point. We've taken about 5,000 megawatts off the grid. And who's making up for that? Well, they want natural gas turbines and combined cycle systems, but for right now, the folks up at Ontario are like, yay! And, Quebec Hydro is like, oh, God, our budget. We get to sell the most expensive electricity in the world to New England. So there's a lot of customers out there in the West. Then there's other customers in Indonesia and Malaysia, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and then we're going to be in direct competition with China and India and Russia on that because they're developing these things too. But we don't have we haven't turned a shovel of dirt yet on it. We still need to do a site selection and all that sort of engineering.
So one lesson to take away is that there's more energy in the queue that we can use than you can imagine. Whether it's natural gas that hasn't been discovered or whatever, or this, there's a lot, you're not going to run out of energy.
Well, you're not going to run out of energy, but what's going to happen is, there's people that have realized, if not this, something very close to this is going to be the low-cost energy provider. And so you aren't going to frack gas and run LNG cryogenic systems. You're not going to dig coal out of the ground, and because it will at some point very quickly become uneconomic. Now, obviously not when the first IMSR is built or the 100th, but somewhere down the road it'll be a completely artificial market. If coal and natural gas are still important sources of energy, 300 units into this, and they're not just being run down and cash cowed, then something has gone wrong. That's a political decision someone made, but not an economic or resource decision. Yes, sir.
And you haven't built any stateside?
No. We have experimental salt loops and things like that, and of course the original molten salt reactor experiment and the aircraft reactor. We built stateside in the glory days of the U.S. nuclear program, we built about 5 versions of molten salt reactors. Oh no! And so we built a couple things called aircraft reactors. The original idea was that the Navy had a nuclear submarine, and so the Air Force was like, well, we want one too. And so they were going to build like a flying submarine and put a nuclear reactor on it, which is a really bad idea. But the guys at Oak Ridge were like, oh, okay, we'll take your money. You know, everyone knew it was not the best idea, but they said, you know, if we get the money, we're going to go do it. And they did some beautiful work. They built a reactor about the size of that council there that put out 60 megawatts of thermal heat. So that was pretty tremendous. The trouble is you needed about a meter of lead shielding between the reactor and the crew, and that made for a pretty heavy airplane, you know, and sort of didn't take away from the whole, you know, flying into a mountain or getting shot down aspect of things, and they sort of picked a funny name. They called it the fireball reactor, which probably wasn't the most, like, you know, confidence building thing. But I'll tell you, in all seriousness, you want to know who's digging that idea back out? You know, so look up the Green Dragon program. So China, now it might just be some guy working on his thesis at some Chinese military academy, but somebody somewhere in China is working on a nuclear powered drone that would be like the size of a 737. And now you don't have to worry about the crew. And now you have a drone that can fly with huge amount of munitions, you know, essentially endlessly for maybe a decade. And that is an interesting thought, isn't it? You know, that's an interesting scenario to ponder. And if you're a country that doesn't give a crap that you have a nuclear reactor flying in the air and maybe it falls down, then that's, you know, that's something to consider. So this just gives you a little bit, you know, again, I'm not, you know, going to do the horrible thing of reading a slide to you, but you get it, right? Look at all this, look at all the knock-on things you can do with extraordinary amounts of process heat.
But that's true as an output for any source of energy. It's not the IMSR.
Well, any source of high temperature. So a lot of this stuff.
Enables it by its efficiency.
Right, exactly. So a lot of this stuff was originally developed for the HTGR program. The only advanced reactor program that America supported for 30 years was the high temperature gas reactor. But if you look at what a high temperature gas reactor, you know, you're talking about 1,000 degrees Celsius with hydrogen and helium and triso balls and all that, and it's extraordinarily fragile and extraordinarily complex to get maybe 50 to 100 megawatts of power. It's utterly uneconomic. But all this work, you know, we could essentially take that HTGR out of the loop and put the IMSR in there and then recalculate everything, and all of a sudden those numbers that look pretty good with an HTGR look really, really good with an IMSR, you know? And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is just, you know, you could just take that out and put, you know, a black box of super hotness, you know, and then you just have to say whose black box is the best black box, and the IMSR is the best black box you can stick in there. You know, a lot of this was done for NuScale too, and NuScale is a natural circulation light water reactor, but, you know, they have this tremendously huge and complex reactor, and it, you know, it puts out a nominal amount of power, and so, you know, what are you getting for that? Well, you're getting a much safer light water reactor, but you're not getting a lot, you know, you're not getting a lot else for it. You're still, you know, 18, 24 months fuel change out cycles, all that stuff. So here's some other block diagrams to sort of show how this sort of combined, you know, low carbon electrical grid, you know, call that a salt battery if you want, you know, so concentrated solar and batteries and PV and wind and all that, we can all share it, you know. So if you're really, really into a green future, well, you need a molten salt reactor, you know. We don't need you, but you need us, because you're not going to be able to rely on, you know, when guys like Tesla talk about, you know, a battery, they're talking about a traditional battery of which, you know, it's going to become ever more hard to justify making batteries like proton exchange membrane type batteries, you know. But thermal batteries, you know, now you're talking. now you might have something there. So maybe you buy a little more time. This is a little bit of verbiage about our waste stream isn't really waste. You know, we get rare earths in our waste stream. We get really valuable medical isotopes in our waste stream. There's a lot of things we can do with the byproducts from a molten salt reactor. And this is from INL. This is actually just a screen grab from a presentation INL gave. You know, this is a national security imperative. You know, y'all in this room really have got to be crossing your fingers that somebody in the West, mainly Terrestrial Energy, crosses this finish line in a hurry. And we better not be very far behind the Chinese. We're going to be behind them. I mean, there's no question about it. They are 1 year away from starting up the first new molten salt reactor. They'll have the thorium molten salt reactor, the TMSR, started up next year. 2 megawatts, tiny little thing, but they've set up the whole supply chain. So they've started a nuclear graphite industry. They've started up a specialty high nickel stainless steel industry. They've done all the things that we've lost. You know, we got Haynes Metal in Indiana that invented Hastelloy-N, so we got that. You know, we don't have a fuel salt, you know, supply chain. They do. You know, we don't have much of a nuclear graphite business in this country. Luckily, we do in France and England, so our Western allies, we do have sources for it, you know. But they're doing the stuff, and most importantly, they are training a cadre of 1,500 engineers in China to do this. And so they could have done it much quicker than that, but they're not stupid. We have to build the supply chain before we do it. We're not just going to rush, throw one together, and have 15 people who know how it works. We want to take our time, put everything in place, and have 1,500 people who know how it works, so we can send them to the far corners of the kingdom and get it to transfer over to this. And this is unfortunate. This is my last slide for you. This is sort of a little bit of Pollyanna-ish behavior, if you ask me. And the Department of Energy and the Chinese Academy of Sciences signed a memorandum of understanding in 2011. In 2010, Zhao Zhiming, the head of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, came to Oak Ridge National Lab. And Oak Ridge was like, oh my God. And he came and they wanted to show him the spallation neutron source that had just opened up. They wanted to show him the HIFER reactor, the high flux reactor that they've run successfully. And they came and they said, what do you want to see first? And they said, we want to see the MSRE. And they're like, what? That old thing? And they're like, yeah, we want to go see how that MSRE worked. And that was all they wanted to see. And they went there and they looked at it. They looked at the millions of words and thousands of online documents regarding the operation of the molten salt reactor experiment, because we're kind of silly that way. We put all that information out on the internet, all the chemistry, how we did it, the experimentation, the after experiment results. And China took all that and they ran with it. And we said, hey China, you know what? We'll help you, you know, because we all want to be buddies. And this is exactly, you know, this is a document from October of 2012. This is the memorandum of understanding that Thorium Energy Alliance spent about $100,000 in several years, and several lawyers, and a Freedom of Information Act. And we got this. And they kept denying that, you know, oh, well, you know, that's not, you know, that's a myth, that's a rumor. But finally, because we had a very brave professor at Stanford he did not like this. And so he gave us 30 of this 180 pages. And because we had those 30 pages, we were able to go and say, we know it exists. And they're like, fine, it's not a secret anyways. And they published it. And so we got this from our Freedom. And it's like, when you have to do that, you know that it's not probably the best formula for success in the world, because all this work, hydrogen production, hybrid energy systems based on thorium molten salt reactor, I know the resolution is kind of sucky, coal-derived clean fuel and chemicals from thorium molten salt reactor. They've been doing, you know, they're working on this. They're 6 years into working on this, you know? And they're working on it with the help of Idaho National Lab and Oak Ridge National Lab and MIT and Stanford and Argonne. You know, and the trouble is, fine, and I'll give them this, they have kept their word, absolutely. Every year they issue a report on their work. But what it is, unfortunately, it's like saying, I'm going to help you learn how to make a wedding cake. And at the end of it, we get a recipe card for how to make a wedding cake. But we don't have any chickens to make the eggs, and we don't know what a pot is, and our ovens don't work anymore. And even if we did, no one really knows how to make a meringue, and what is icing? So it's like they've been absolutely truthful, and they've kept their every part of their bargain. They hand over binders of information that we have no ability to act upon. And some people will be like, oh, we can set that stuff up in a hurry. Well, I just told you, we built 70 reactors in 30 years, and then we haven't built one since. So I don't think hurry is the adjective that I would use to describe how we work nuclear projects in the Western world. So I don't know what it takes. I don't know what it takes to make this actionable, but you guys know it now, and I've infected your brains with this information, so you can't unsee this. You're going to run screaming out of here, trying to grind dirt in your eyes, but it's here. And so this is something, this is sort of like a little heads up for you. I hope this is a little bit of a heads up for you, because this should be starting to bubble around in your head. What are the geopolitical implications for this, right? What does it mean when they make the lowest cost hydrogen in the world, and they make their own liquid fuels, the best liquid fuels, sulfur-free, super energy dense? What happens when they're already the low-cost labor provider? What happens when they are going way high up on the value add, and they're the low-cost, supplier of plastics and ethylene and fertilizer? And so think about that this happy weekend. And if you want, part of that, to just one last little side note, I left out a whole discussion about rare earths. But remember, going back to the beginning of the talk, you get thorium for free when you process rare earths. And you get rare earths for free when you mine iron and titanium and phosphate and other metals. Well, we don't process. 97% of rare earths come out of China. Okay? And about the other 3% aren't really valuable rare earths. It's like cerium and lanthanum, and we use it for like polishing compounds. So effectively 100% of all heavy rare earths, all the things you love in this world, your phone, the starter on your car, your radio, your TV, the holmium laser that's going to cure you of cancer, all the things, the magical things that rare earths do. When you do R&D in this country and you develop a new medical laser, what's the one country in the world that you can go to produce it in? Well, there is only one. So all this R&D, hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of R&D, is going to serve one country. And it's not us, unfortunately. So why don't we reverse that? Why don't we make rare earths here, and as a byproduct, we get tons of fuel. So rare earths bring us into a future, highly decarbonized economy, and we power that economy with molten salt reactors fueled with thorium that we got for free from digging the raw materials out of the ground anyways. Well, yes, sir.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for the information you provided. You've already changed my perspective on the whole issue.
Is it like...
Just trying to, just boom. So my question basically stems from, and someone else sort of hit on it, the public versus private. So the problem with like states and dealing with cooperatives and all that, like public perception of nuclear reactors in general, that's one big problem. So it seems already that a lot of this work can be done on the industrial side. More manufacturing, more big companies will be more inclined to want to take heat and develop it. Mm-hmm. So how, or what's one of the big sort of incentives to kind of spark the public's interest via like a state cooperative, like you mentioned, Southern Company. Mm-hmm. Doing the new reactors and
yep.
Trying something. So how are you sort of trying to infiltrate into the minds of states and the public side? Like, what's the big...
Yeah. I mean, nuclear is not unloved everywhere. You know, Southern Company, absolutely. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned Southern Company, so either you're psychic or you read up a little bit on it. But
You said something about the chloride.
oh, yeah, Terra Power, and yeah, so Southern Company is the last power generation company to have its own in-house R&D program, and they are absolutely supporting our work and Terra Power's work, and they're also the ones building Plant Vogtle 3 and 4. Now, they have been poorly served by Westinghouse and Chicago Bridge and Iron. You know, that plant, like every other nuclear plant, is, you know, fallen behind, and, you know, it's just a sad black eye that we've lost so much technological know-how. And it's, you know, it's arguably, it's just proof that, you know, the nuke plants have gotten too big. That's just, they're enormous and gigantic. And when you have a $14 million nuclear, or $14 billion nuclear power plant, and the entire valuation of your company is only $20 billion, you know, you're basically betting, you know, 2/3 of the valuation of your company on 2 assets. That's a big risk. So that's another reason why these could be a lot more acceptable in a lot more places, even in the West, maybe even in California, you know, because a 400 megawatt reactor, you know, let's say it costs $2 per, you know, so worst case scenario, $800 million. That's within the reason, that's within the grasp of like $800 million for 200 megawatts of electricity on the grid. That's cheap, you know, and that's the most expensive it'll get. You know, if we go down a traditional, you know, economy of scale and learning curve, over time that price should get less. I would like to think it would get much less, but it should be less. It certainly shouldn't be more. You know, the trouble with building like those big bombs, those big old Plant Vogtle 3 and 4, you know, you're building a reactor and you're building it out in the rain, and you're building it out in the snow, you know, and you're building it out in the mud, and then you're building another one. You know, you're not getting any, you know, you're not getting any, you know, benefit from building 2 of them. You know, it's like, okay, maybe a little, but not much, you know. So I hope that answers your question, but there is some acceptance because of the size, because of the cost, that even in the United States, you know, even in some of the states where industry still is, you know, pretty lively, you know, there are places even in the United States that would welcome new nuclear power. And believe me, go to where Yankee just got shut down, you know, and ask the people in that neighborhood if they'd like to have Vermont Yankee turned back on, because they lost hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. You know, they lost thousands of super high paid workers. You know, and they shut that down for what? Because it was releasing less tritium than you can find in a banana. You know, so people don't understand radiation. That's a whole nother talk. Yes, sir.
So I understand the safety aspects that you mentioned of having everything integrated, but I mean, you said the pumps are notionally optional. You said that you needed to keep adding more molten salt, or else the reactor would shut itself down. So it seems like whenever you swap out these core units, all you're really swapping out is the graphite control rods. And it kind of seems like what you've done is once you've manufactured these power plants, you've got them signed up on a subscription model for these reactor cores. Did that play any part in the decision?
Yeah, that's a little bit. I think I said it's a little bit of the, a little bit of the razor and razor blade aspect to this. You know, is that you know, you buy the razor handle and, you know, you get the Mach 3 razor head, and then maybe you get the Mach 4 and then the Mach 5. You know, that is the opportunity. Is like, it's not just, you know, some scheming way like, we've got you on the hook now for the next 56 years, you know. It's more like every 7 years. So the old DMSR, right, the denatured molten salt reactor, this is a moderated reactor, and these aren't rods, this is a big graphite cylinder made up of lots of little, logs essentially. And they have fuel channels, and the fuel just goes through, so it's like your shower head or something like that. And it can only last that long. So even the other designs for this were you'd get this big core transfer machine that would go and sit on it like a chicken, and it'd go boop, and it'd pop the top off, put the top to the side, it would reach down and pull out this like 80-ton core and put it in a chamber. You know, you can imagine how big this machine was, and then, you know, drop a new core in and shut it all up. And we're like, you know, we did a study and we're like, well, do we want to just, because we could conceivably just replace the core, right? But then, you know, ASME and NRC requires you inspect the heat exchangers every 10 years. You know, the NRC, you got to inspect the vessel walls. And we're like, you know what? There's so much stuff you have to do. It's so hard to pull that core out. And when you pull it out, what are you getting for that? Well, now you're pulling a radioactive core out of a containment. You know, theoretically, at the end of life, this thing is in its own, you know, it's in its own sarcophagus already. So, you know, at some point, you know, we put these things in a, let's see here, you know, we put these things in these silos. Maybe some future generation that's a lot smarter than me, you know, at the end, you know, so these are made for, you know, nominally 8 cores, right? So 56 years, but essentially it could go forever, right? It's just, that's all the silos we put out here. If we start emptying the silo and maybe we check to make sure cement and stainless is in okay, yeah, we could run this thing for 100 years. I mean, there's no, because every 7 years we've renewed it. But then these things here, you're like, well, what are you gonna do with those? Well, you know, maybe we crack them open like a tuna can and see what's in there. Maybe there's some really valuable stuff in there. Or maybe we just do a deep borehole project, which they're looking at now, and we just dig one hell of a deep hole and be like, bloop, you know, and drop it down in there. It'd be a shame because it's kind of valuable, you know, it's expensive stainless steel, but it's not a lot. I mean, in the scheme of things, it's not a lot. Or maybe we densify it. You know, we put it in the world's biggest trash compactor, and we just, you know, swoosh a little thing down there, and, you know, and then we leave it for the next generation who may be even smarter than them, you know, and they can figure out how to, you know, melt it down or do something with it. So, did that answer your question, or did I go far afield for you?
No, just so it's a largely a regulatory issue with heat exchangers, it seems like.
Yeah, and other parts, you know, you have to inspect all that stuff anyways. You have to pull, whether it's pumped or not pumped, you have to, you know, inspect flanges and valves and fittings and stuff. So if you got to do it, if you're taking all that stuff apart, just replace it, you know. It's, believe me, we looked at it, and we looked at the economics of replacing individual parts versus replacing the system. And the system approach makes more economic sense even for the end user, you know. Yes, sir.
So with like current regulations, everything, if you all like got the green light to build one of these, how long do you think it would take from breaking ground all the way to like lighting it off?
I think it would go quickly because these are not big facilities. The thought is that we would build, I mean, for like unit 1, you know, or, you know, N of 1, you know, it might take a little longer because I would like to think that we would set up the manufacturing facility first, you know, so, or, you know, concurrently with it. And there's a lot of, you know, there's just some things you're never going to get away with. If we got a site license tomorrow from like, you know, Tennessee Valley Authority, let's say, you know, the first thing you'd have to do is do all sorts of surveys and seismic surveys, and you'd have to find out where groundwater is and stuff like that. You know, so there's a lot of long lead time. You have to do like public buy-in sort of, you know, awareness. So, I mean, even if we could put one of these up in 2 years, which I think is, you know, a combined cycle gas facility, like we just worked on an 800 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine. And that took about two years to fully stand up, 3 years to fully commission and really get it making power on the grid. So I think that would be a comparable situation. You know, this facility is about 100 feet wide, 200 and some change feet long, maybe 8-9 stories tall. These units aren't terribly big. They're, you know, these core units are about 4 or 5 meters in diameter, 8 to 10 meters tall. You know, you could possibly move them by truck or train if you didn't have a lot of bridges in your way. You know, so overall, everything, you know, the SST 5000 balance of plant, if you're just going to make electricity and be boring, you know, that thing is fits in a gen hall with steam generators that are about 90 feet tall and 150 feet long. So you're talking about pretty small scale stuff. I mean, certainly smaller than like a Costco or something like that. You know, the entire footprint for our facility, you know, going back to even the beginning, well, you know what, I could do this one here. You know, this entire footprint, you know, this whole thing here is only like 13 acres. That's tiny. So 2.5 to 3 years to build that, but for the first one or first couple, I would say you'd probably add another 2, 3, 5 years to get the manufacturing system in place and supply chain network and things like that. After that, though, you know, the next one could go quicker and quicker still, because the buildings are meant to be prefabricated, you know, made out of they're called sandwich membrane, you know. So what it is you take 2 sheets of like 1/2 inch thick stainless steel, you put interwebbing in them, and you make that all in a factory, and they go together like Legos, and then you backfill them with some nuclear concrete, and boom, you got a building. You know, you're not sitting there like Plant Vogel, you know, welding stuff out in the rain with 4 inspectors standing around you, you know. So you do, and I mean, maybe you still have the 4 inspectors, but they're standing dry in a climate-controlled warehouse, you know, fabricating that stuff. Yes, sir.
Have some of those technologies you spoke about, like the chemical synthesis and desalination, do they use some of those with the current nuclear power plants?
Oh, yeah. You know, Diablo Canyon can desalinate well over 6 million gallons of water a day. And during the drought 2 years ago, you can bet that the people around Diablo Canyon love nuclear, because everyone else was taking 1-minute showers, and they got Diablo Canyon free of charge, gave the county, you know, like 6 million gallons a day of desalinated water. You know, because Diablo Canyon was supposed to have like 8 reactors, they only have 2. And so they way overbuilt the infrastructure there. So it's a, you know, and Israel desalinates water like crazy. Saudi Arabia expends vast amounts of their oil on air conditioning and desalination, you know. So they're only going to be able to burn their furniture for so long. You know, all these technologies, the Fischer-Tropsch process, like I said, the Nazis were doing that, you know, turning coal into JP6 back in the 30s. You know, the South Africa, when they were being embargoed because of apartheid, you know, South Africa to this day makes all their own diesel fuel and JP8 from coal. And it's filthy as hell. They have to burn 4 tons of coal to get 1 ton of fuel. But, you know, they did that because they were being embargoed by the rest of the world, and now it's a big industry there that employs a lot of people, so they just keep doing it. But imagine if you can go burning 4 tons of coal to get 1 ton of fuel, to taking 1 ton of coal and turning it into 1.1 ton of fuel plus 800 pounds of other byproducts. I think that is one of the most exciting things you can do with this, is take coal to liquid fuels with all the other byproducts you can get out of it. Not that coal, it still wouldn't make it the cleanest thing in the world, but you know, it would make you go from making $50 a ton for coal to $1,800 a ton for diesel. That's pretty good. Yes, sir.
So about 11 years ago, a colleague of yours came and briefed liquid thorium reactors. We were considering putting in a ship design.
Mm-hmm.
It's Kurt Sorensen, I think.
Oh, yeah?
So that was 11 years ago. What are the barriers to entry here, the barriers to implementation? It's almost the same brief on the same stage.
Well, Kirk's a nice fellow, but he's sort of like a lone wolf kind of guy. And, you know, the big difference is Terrestrial is raised, you know, been very businesslike. We are well down the regulatory path. You know, this is an actual business. We've raised scores of millions of dollars. We have, if you know, not to toot our horn, but I encourage you to go to the terrestrialenergy.com, and you can see we have industrial partners from Caterpillar to Lockheed Martin to Southern Company. We have energy companies on board, from old line petroleum companies to Southern Company to Tennessee Valley Authority. We've won many GAIN grants, which is an accelerated nuclear innovation grant in the United States. We are at the final stage to get a $1.2 billion loan guarantee from the Department of Energy. And we are in the second stage VDR process with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So we're doing what it takes to do this stuff. Kirk was a good evangelist for this stuff, but that's basically where it ended. He had some interesting engineering ideas and things like that, but the terrestrial energy has been more concentrated on reducing this stuff to practice, trying to make this practical and realizable by the mid-2020s, which I think is, eminently achievable goal.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the plant that you're talking about with Kirk, and I've been following you guys for a while now.
Oh, good.
And the idea was fantastic, except that it seems to be like the third or fourth stage. Once everybody loves nuclear, then we can get to that point where people are comfortable with reprocessing in a whole giant nuclear spectrum. This is far more business related.
Yeah, this is a very, we don't want to come out with a Ferrari out of the gate.
Right.
We're coming out with a little John Deere tractor, and we're gonna a little working mule that's just gonna chug along, and you can shoot it with a shotgun, and you'll be like, keep doing its work, Whereas we're not trying to we don't need a Ferrari, that'd be nice to someday get to a Ferrari where you run stuff like the Pure cycle, the Pure cycle is magical, thorium to U-232 and all that. But it's not practical today. You can't do it. And some people want to use like a salt called FLIBE, and it's it's illegal to use the lithium, and it's really hard to use beryllium. So why paint yourself into a corner to use materials that are may as well be unobtainium? You can't get it. So be practical. Use salts that are commercially available today. Use commercially available, high nickel materials today, not exotica, that it doesn't exist, We're using a single fluid design, not two fluids that need to be separated by magical barriers, And so it's like, yep, let's get there someday, let's make, chloride reactors are super interesting, but they have more, TerraPower has more money than us, so maybe they'll beat us to the finish line. And they'll solve, but we just think as a startup company, this is the reactor that has the nearest term closest to be achieved, technological issues. This can be reduced to commercial practice, in a matter of years. Whereas I think the other ones are much longer lead time stuff. I don't think that, it's not that they can't be done, they just can't be done practically now. It's just like you say, it's so hard to get people behind nukes. Let's get them behind that first and get them all excited, and then we can Gen 6 and Gen 8 and whatever you want to call it. This is Gen 4. You can do Gen 8 and 9. Let your kids have something to do.
Suggest you put solar cells on the roof. It'll sell a lot better.
Oh, dude.
You get a lot more money. Just tell them it's solar. Just tell the regulators it's nuclear.
Oh,
Figure it out later.
that's a Pickering up in Canada has windmills. I'm like, that's awesome. But actually, this is a big radiator. This is the roof, and this is a.
They don't care. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, just.
I'm sorry.
No.
I live down near Diablo Canyon, actually Vandenberg Air Force Base, but they have no clue what they're getting from the reactors around there. They think the solar cells down there are delivering all the.
Oh.
Trust me.
Well, they'll learn quick enough.
They'll learn when it shuts down.
Yeah. They'll learn that Nevada and Arizona have a bunch of coal plants waiting for them. But then they won't care. It's like having Chinese make their solar cells. They want, Arizona and Nevada to make their dirty electricity, and they just get electrons that come out of their outlets, and they're like, look at how pure and beautiful we are. It's like, well, you're not. You're selfish, and you've just put the problems on the backs of other people, and you've burdened the rest of the world with your beautiful lifestyle, and it's going to come back to haunt you.
Last question.
I guess I'm just trying to track some of this because it feels like it's going in a circle. You like your IMSR because it gets away from coal and some other energy sources, but your primary gains you say is through heat energy. Everybody races, from what I understand from the energy perspective, towards electrical. Everyone wants to get to electrical. That's where people feel that energy is going towards delivery, electric vehicles and everything. And I understand the thermal aspect, because there's geothermal and there's a lot of interest in that. But yours doesn't take it away, like you still want coal. Because you want, when you talk about the synthetic fuels, you still need coal. When you talk about it's air cooled, so you don't need it by rivers, but if you're doing desalination, you still need it by water. So a lot of I guess your benefits seem,
Well-
imagine that electrolysis is electric-based.
So what you have, I get what you're getting at, and so there's an excellent paper out there in IEEE about Google.org. It's Google.org's swan song, RE less than C, renewable energy less than coal, right? And their swan song was, and the second Thorium Energy Alliance conference was at the Googleplex, because Google was really supporting us for a while, but then they decided nuclear is too freaky for Google, even though they personally support it. And we were going to have a little troop of Google guys sitting in the back here today, but it was a little bit of short notice. Anywho, so Google, RE less than C, came out with this swan song statement that said, we looked at the entire energy market and we realized if we completely decarbonized electricity use, that's only 30% of where all the carbon comes from. The other 70% comes from industrial things like making cement and iron and petrochemicals and cracking chemical and making plastic and fertilizer, and transportation fuels. That's where the they ended it. And these guys who wrote it, I knew them kind of well, and they're like, our bosses wouldn't let us say what we wanted to say, but it said, if only there was a source of high temperature process heat that was carbon free, ... And I was like, oh, you know what that is. That's, the molten salt reactor. And they're like, well, our bosses wouldn't let us say that. We just had to postulate, if only there were. Because, if all these windmills and solar cells take care of that 30% of the electricity, and what if we really do? Your governor just gave the state of the state address yesterday and wants 5 million electric cars on the road, and we get more electric trains. We just get more electrical every day in every way. Let's say more Tesla over-the-road trucks and stuff like that. It doesn't. So let's say electricity makes up 50%. So you're still got 50% of the world. You're taking a lot of that electricity and just turning it back into heat. So what could be more inefficient than making electricity, losing a great deal of it, through conversion, then losing some of it through transmission, then losing some more of it, reconverting it back into heat, So it's like, let's just skip all that middleman stuff and let's make reactors that we can, let's take care of that 70% that isn't electricity, or 60 or 50, however you want to slice that pie. There's a huge chunk of that carbon pie that is not electricity, that has nothing to do with electricity. So that's where I'm coming from, is that we can do both, We can do the balance of plant with electricity, and we can take care of this heavy-duty stuff over here. Well, that's it. Folks, I really appreciate your time.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thanks.